So, right, so this is, this presentation is called What the Bible Really Says About LGBTQ People. And it's based on, the information that I have is based on work that I did when I was studying for my first master's degree, and this was back in the mid-90s. So as far as contemporary scholarship, this is 20 years old. But it's the same. I mean, there's, you know, this is what it is. So what I want to start with is taking a look at the Bible passages that are commonly understood as condemning homosexuality. And so, does anybody have a Bible passage in mind, or a story, or anything like that, that to you is like, whoa, this is the one that my, you know, brother-in-law or whatever it is always cites? Does anybody have something like that?
Well, you know, we're just reading Paul.
Uh-huh.
So there's
that was the best one.
yeah, that was the one.
So which one in Paul?
Romans.
Great. Okay.
When he says all those things.
Yes. So George, would you? I've got Bibles here.
I thought I'd get a couple more in case people want.
Okay. So I have a couple of fixed Bibles, and George has his Bible. Would somebody be willing to take the tab here that says Romans 1:26 through 27 and read it? And then I've got another tab here. You don't have to hear. Aisha?
You can read it.
Okay, Aisha gets King James, and Andy can have NRSV.
So you want me to read
Romans 1:26 to 27. And just a second. So, just a word.
I can listen.
A couple words briefly about how we're going to do this. I have a handout here that I'm actually going to give you at the end. So don't worry, you'll have all the references. You can go home with it. You can look in your own Bible and see what it says, all that stuff. And what I'm working with right now is 3 different translations. We've got the King James Version. We have the New International Version, which is a very common version, and we have the New Revised Standard Version, which is the version that we read in church. So can we start?
I'm sorry, will you get that last paragraph, sentence?
The New Revised Standard Version of the Bible is the one that Andy has, and that's the one that we read in church.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Aisha, could I ask you to find the tab there that says Romans 1:26 and 27,
Yeah, right here.
and go ahead and read just those 2 verses for us.
For this cause God gave them up into vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their own lust with one toward another. Men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet.
Right. And George, could you read the NIV of 26 and 27?
Sure. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with the lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for this perversion.
Okay. And Andy.
For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error.
Sounds kind of obvious, right?
Yeah.
It sounds kind of obvious. There's a couple things that we need to understand in order to really get inside this passage. So first of all, we got to think of the context. Paul is writing a letter to the Romans. And whenever you write a letter, you have a reason why you're writing the letter, right? And he hasn't been to Rome yet. So one of the things he's trying to do is introduce himself to folks in Rome and get them on his side. So right here, he's speaking to the Jewish community in Rome. Remember, the Jewish community and Christian community weren't so separate like they are now. It was, so he's writing to Jewish Christians, or people he is hoping, who are Jewish, who he's hoping to reach with the good news of Jesus. So what he's doing is talking about what happens to people who worship idols. Okay, so the beginning of each of those passages that we heard was something along the lines of because of this, or for this reason, right? So you have to say, well, for what reason? Wait, what came before that?
He just said for the cause, and the cause of what?
For the cause of what? Exactly. For the cause of worshiping idols. That's what comes right before this. So what we're seeing is that what he's talking about is not the cause of something, it is the effect of something, right? So what he's telling the folks in Rome is that because those people were worshiping idols, that made them do these things, these unnatural things, right? Which was same-sex sexual activity. Now, there's another thing that we have to look at. We have to ask ourselves what the word natural means, because we kind of hear the word natural and we say, well, that's the way nature intends things, right? And unnatural would be against nature, something that is somehow wrong. It's unnatural. You know, that to us kind of has almost a moral connotation. This word isn't used in that same way. So one thing with the Bible, when we're looking at a specific word, it's helpful to see how that word is used in other places, right? So among other things, Paul uses the same word to refer to circumcision. This is the word unnatural. Circumcision, men with long hair, or even later in this same letter, God does something that he refers to as unnatural. So, if God can be unnatural, does that mean that unnatural is necessarily some kind of blanket moral condemnation? It seems to mean, instead, customary. Something like what is normal. And what, of course, is normal in a heteronormative society would be opposite sex relationships. So if people are doing something that is different from that, he's using the word unnatural to refer to that. And he's using it specifically in the way of, and this is what you get when you worship idols. When you worship idols, then you wind up doing stuff that's not natural for you. Some scholars actually have said, well, he's in a heteronormative society, right? You assume that everybody is heterosexual. And so you would say any same-sex sexual activity would be somehow unusual. It would be non-customary. So that's the set of assumptions that he is working out of. So if God can be unnatural, then surely it is not actually a moral condemnation to be called unnatural. So this actually does not tell us anything about what we currently understand as homosexuality, same-sex sexual attraction, LGBTQ people. Right? So that's Romans. Let's move to another one. Sodom, great.
No,
Thank you.
Laura.
You know what? Actually, Andy, would you like to read? Sodom is. I'm only marked it once because it's a long story. So, if you can just read, I think it's 1 through 26. Whatever it says is marked there.
Looks like it starts at 19.
Yeah, whatever. Genesis chapter 19, and then verses 1 through 26. Yeah. Go ahead.
The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we may know them." Lot went out of the house, out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone that you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy this city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else they will be consumed in the punishment of this city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife, and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. And they brought him out and left him outside the city. When they had brought them outside, they said, "Flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, your servant has found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot flee for the hills, for fear the disaster will overtake me, and I will die." That's 19. How much?
You know what, that's enough. The rest that happens is that they just go ahead and flee, and then Lot's wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
You know,
Thank you, Andy.
in hearing that, a thing that shocks me the most that they don't talk about, you're going to give him his 2 virgin daughters?
Thank you, Aisha.
I said, let me read this again.
Yes.
Yeah, we
Okay,
didn't
so-
mind giving up his
I mean, that's horrible.
Right. So this right.
And they don't consider that a sin?
This, right. So Lot is not a native of the town of Sodom, right? He had come there from outside. They referred to him as an alien in the town, and he meets these 2 strangers. They happen to be angels. The reader knows that, but Lot doesn't know it.
I'm not sure that he doesn't. I think.
No, he doesn't know. It's not in the text that he knows. So he's doing what he should do, which is inviting them in. He's being hospitable to them, and that is what is required of him. Just because in this environment, if you let the strangers from wherever they are sleep in the town square, well, what do you think was going to happen? I mean, you saw what was going to happen. So Lot invites them to his house, and then when the men of the town come out, they surround the house, right? This isn't like this polite, like, knock on the door and we'd like to get to know these people. There are some arguments who would say, well, it says no, they want to know him, they just want to be introduced. Well, baloney, because of what Aisha said, right? Because a simple how do you do does not, you're not trying to deflect that by offering your 2 virgin daughters. Lot knows exactly what's going on. Lot knows exactly what these men want. This was, the threat was of gang rape, right? The men were very aggressive. They wanted to dominate the visiting men, and furthermore shame and dominate Lot, because he is also an alien, right? So they want to exert their power over both Lot, who is somebody they don't really, he's not one of them, and these 2 visitors. So yeah, what they want is that Lot's going to turn these 2 men out and they're going to gang rape them. There is a parallel story to this one in the book of Judges where that becomes even more clear, actually. It's a slightly different story, but it's a parallel where the visiting man actually sends his concubine out. They rape and kill the concubine. So it's very clear what their intent actually is.
Love the Bible.
So when you say, and it refers various times in the Bible to the sin of Sodom and what a terrible sin the sin of Sodom is, and all of that. And when you assume that the sin of Sodom is simply men wanting to have sex with other men, right, in a regular, kind, gentle, kind of loving way, right? That's not what we're talking about. That's just totally erroneous. The sin of Sodom was the threat of gang rape, the threat of violence, inhospitality, the desire to dominate people who came into the town, visitors in the town, through violence. So that's the sin of Sodom. Yeah.
Had God decided to destroy Sodom anyway?
Right.
This was just one incident.
That's also in the text, isn't it? Yeah. Yes. Exactly. So it says, well, when they kind of say, well, actually, we're going to destroy this town. They kind of,
Because they've been wild and wicked for a long time.
Right, and the cry of the people has come to the ears of God, or something, whatever it is, right? So clearly, this was not, the first strike against the city of Sodom. This was the final strike by the way they were behaving. So then, of course, we have a problem, because then anytime we use the word sodomy or sodomite, we know what is meant by that, right? Sodomy is anal sex between 2 men. Sodomite is somebody who does that. But that's wrong, because Sodom had nothing to do with that. Sodom had everything to do with violent rape. So, bye, Carolyn.
Bye, I'm sorry.
So are there any questions about that, Scott? Yeah?
You have to excuse my
It's okay.
non-knowledge of the Bible. Is this the same as Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Gomorrah's just
I
another
didn't hear
town.
Gomorrah there's, okay.
It's just another town again.
I had a completely different concept of that story, that God destroyed the town because of the wrong moral things that were going on.
Right. That is what happened, but the culmination of the wrong moral things that were happening was this example with Lot and the angels and the...
There's some morality that's discussed in the beginning of that story. I mean, the people are coming with some type of morality that they want to just get to those 2 men. Correct? Why do they want to kill them?
No.
Why do they want them?
Okay.
Because
so
they're
the
going
people,
against God.
the people of the town are coming to Lot's house. Lot has invited the 2 men in, right, to shelter them for the night. The people of the town want, because they are strangers, that's why they want to get them. They're just
Just because they're strangers?
Just because they're strangers, right.
Oh, okay.
They're not very nice. It's xenophobia,
It
perhaps,
doesn't
or...
sound very hospitable.
It's not very hospitable, no. That, I mean, and actually, in hospitality...
I goofed you up on that
You
one.
did, it's your fault. That's one way of looking at the sin of Sodom, except for it's not just inhospitality in terms of like, come into my house, but I'm not going to give you a nice chair and I won't give you a glass of water. It's like, come into my town and I will, hurt you violently. That's inhospitality, right?
Hospitality was taken really seriously.
Right.
Like if you took someone, if someone came up to you and gave them a piece of bread, they're like your family now. You're obligated to protect them and be good to them. That was a very common social custom in pre-modern times. So
Right.
like you were like now had to be their protector. So if you didn't act that way, that was a huge kind of wickedness. I mean, that was a terrible thing to be inhospitable, to betray your guest or something like that. They had now to be like your family until they left. Then they were strangers again.
And think specifically about the context, right? We're in pre-modern desert society, right? I mean, it's harsh conditions if you wind up sleeping outside and there's not a lot of food that you can just pick up. You can't go to the 7-Eleven. So there's that, and also the fact that Lot himself was an alien in the town. So it's kind of double inhospitality, where they're going both after Lot because he's an alien, and after the two visitors who we don't know. Yeah.
Well, Lot was also bringing in a different kind of religion. He was
Right.
bringing in his belief system, which was probably very threatening to the people of Sodom.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what was the religion of the people of Sodom?
Pagans.
Whatever the local pagan religion was, they would have had a local set of gods. I don't know, but yeah, they weren't. Lot was descended from Abraham, so he.
They
was
weren't
coming
Jews
from-
going astray.
No. They were.
This
They
is
were
before all
pagans.
that anyway. This
Yeah.
is the time of Abraham.
Right.
Lot is Abraham's nephew, so it's really hope.
Are there any other Bible passages that you think of when you crash?
I don't know the passage, but are there not things in Leviticus?
Yes.
A lot of them I've used too.
Thank you. Yes, very good. Let's go to Leviticus. Aisha.
Yeah,
It's just that the King James Version is first.
Okay. This last year, we were reading the Bible. Oh, she's going.
Yeah.
Bible. This is the book we got so sick of.
Everyone who sits down
Yes.
to read the Bible bogs down
You
Leviticus.
bog down in
It's
Leviticus.
universal.
I know.
So,
and
Aisha,
Deuteronomy.
if you would read, it's marked there, 1822.
Okay.
If you could look up 1822.
To take this off.
Just the one verse.
Just during the passage here.
Oh, sorry.
Neither shall thou take a wife to her sister.
No, 1822.
18,
Thou
oh,
shalt
I'm sorry,
not.
22. Thou shalt not lie with a mankind as with womankind. It is abomination.
Thank you. Andy.
You shall not lie with the male as with the women. It is an abomination.
Thank you. And George.
Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That is detestable.
Okay. The NIV is that's the NIV, and sometimes it has a slightly different translation. Abomination is the word that we normally hear. Detestable
Yeah.
is sort of a version of that. So that sounds obvious, right? I mean, if you just read it and you go, whoa, that's what it says right there. Again, you have to look at the context. This verse comes in a long list of verses describing lots of different sexual liaisons that are forbidden. And most of them are ones that we would agree with. So, for example, your mother-in-law or and it's all focused on men, guys. Sorry, that's the way it is. So
I don't think we count it very much.
no, not very much. So it's, your wife's sister and things like that, right? That who you're not supposed to have sex with. Just a second. Not all of them are ones that we would consider to be morally wrong. For example, they would in that list is that it's is having sex with a menstruating woman. right? That's not something we consider to be morally wrong. So we have to look at this passage and go, like, what's this list really for? What is this list about? Why is it here? The list is part of what's called the Holiness Code in Leviticus, and it's the rules that God set out for the Jews, the people of Israel, to follow, so that it would be clear who they were and that they were different from the other people around them. Right? That is to say that they're going into Canaan to occupy the land, and one thing that's really important for the Jews, the people of Israel, is that they not simply take up Canaanite practices and become the same as those people. They have to maintain their separateness, their status as God's chosen people. They have to be specifically who they are. And so we have rules and rules and rules, as Aisha pointed out, right? Leviticus is just totally full of rules, and a lot of them are specifically aimed, just like these, at keeping the Jewish people separate from other people.
Do they have the food?
All the dietary rules that's exactly the same.
That's in the same.
thing. So the dietary rules, it's not right in that exact little list, but in a later verse. I mean, it's dietary rules are in a bunch of different places, right? But in a later verse that we can also look at, that's also used against homosexuality, that it is right next to the dietary laws. Actually, how about you go to Leviticus 20:13, which is also marked. Scott, you had a question.
Who is saying it's an abomination?
God.
God is,
Yep.
but who's saying it in writing here? Who's speaking?
God.
God is speaking.
Right.
To who?
Yeah.
To Moses.
So Moses is speaking for God.
The Lord spoke to Moses and said.
Okay, the Lord
And it goes on.
And said all that stuff.
So
Thou
Moses
shalt
is
not do
saying-
this. Thou shalt not do
Okay.
that.
Does this get
So-
back to, what's in the New Testament, John the Baptist told him he shouldn't be marrying his brother's wife? Is that?
That would have probably been related to this, right? Because John was holding up the holiness code, which was in force at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, you shall not with
So,
your father's wife, not with your sister, not with your father's
Thank
daughter.
you. There's a lot of them.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Don't read them all. They
No, I
take too
won't,
long.
because it's that much.
So Aisha, if you would read 20:13.
Okay, oh, you got it marked at 13. If a man also lie with mankind, as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them.
Okay. And Andy?
If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them.
Okay. And George?
If a man lies with a man as one lies with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They must be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads.
Great. So now we have the death penalty for men having sex with other men. Well, that's obvious. Why aren't we doing that? Oh, wait.
Well, that's what the Baptist guys.
That's right. That's what
quoting,
he's
basically.
quoting, right? So, but when we recognize that we're looking at the question not of moral code, but of ritual code, right? Holiness code. This is how you maintain your being part of the people of Israel. This is how you avoid what would be called ritual defilement, right? Also by not eating pork, also by not eating, say, birds of prey or insects or that kind of thing. All this stuff it's all in that same section. What's the word abomination or detestable, right? That's a word, that word in Hebrew. What does that actually mean? In this context, that word means ritual defilement, right? So, I mean, we think abomination means, I hate that, tofu is an abomination to me. I don't like it, right? We're using that word differently from how the Hebrew word that is translated either abomination or detestable is used here in this context. And so when we get to the death sentence, right, it's the same thing. We're looking at ritual defilement. In this particular way, they say, okay, those people should be killed. And then there's other punishments for other kinds of ritual defilement. In the same chapter, so chapter 20, verse 13 was the one we read out loud. In that same chapter, we get references to the dietary laws. So it's all the same. It's all the same set of things. So unless we're actually concerned now with maintaining our purity, Jewish identity, as the Jewish people move into the land of Canaan, right, and not take on those, the aspects of the Canaanite people, right, we want to maintain, unless we're concerned about maintaining our purity in this particular way, this totally just does not apply.
Can I add something?
Sure.
The section is summed up at the end of the chapter. It says, you shall not conform to the institutions of the nations who I'm driving out before you. They did all these things. I told you should occupy this land and would give you possession of it. And it says, I am the Lord your God. I have made a clear separation between you and the nations. You shall make a clear separation between clean beasts and unclean beasts, and between unclean and clean birds. And so
right. That's
I'm
what
making,
I was just referring to, right?
For I have made a clear separation between them and you, declaring them unclean. You shall be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy.
Right.
I have made a clear. Keep saying, I have made a clear separation between you and the heathen, that you may belong to me.
So it's really very specifically talking about separating the people of Israel, the Jewish people, from the people, pagans or whatever you want to, whatever the word would be, that they're going into, so that they maintain their identity. And we're not concerned with that, are we? I mean, that's that's not something we care about.
People haven't changed a great deal, have they?
No.
Not really.
Not really. Not really. Are there any other questions about Leviticus? That's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When Paul says, we're no longer stuck with all these laws.
Right.
Does that apply to this too?
Yeah. Right. So scholars differ, in what they think, and but in general, you would have to say if we're not beholden to these laws because Christ has come, right? Then we're not beholden to these laws. These laws don't count. We don't, we're all allowed to eat shrimp. We all can eat bacon. And lots of people do these things. We wear clothing that has mixed fibers. Probably most of us in this room have clothing with mixed fibers.
What did you say, mixed fiber?
Yes, that is another thing that is forbidden in Leviticus.
Oh, I'm sorry, I guess I'm...
Yeah, Larry, get with it, man.
Polyester's right out.
Not just for the priest, for everybody. I thought it was for the priest.
That particular one might just be for the priest. I can't bring that one to mind right now. But I mean, once, we're no longer beholden to this, right? So there we go. We're done with that. In addition to the fact that was also even a very specific thing.
You're not supposed to have sex with a woman that's menstruating either.
Well, we talked about that already. Yes. So there's a couple more in the New Testament that I don't know if you've got in mind or not. We've already talked about Romans, but if I could get my Bible people to look at 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10. And Aisha, go.
Okay, 9 and 10.
9 and 10, yeah.
Know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor adulterers, nor idolaters, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God.
Right, so it's all about who will not inherit the kingdom of God, right? Long list. Andy, go ahead.
Do you not know what wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God.
George.
I needed that again.
Sorry, 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10.
What was the chapter of it?
6.
6, okay, sorry.
Yeah. I apologize, I've got my back to you.
6.
6, yeah, 9 and 10.
No, starting with 9.
9, yeah.
Okay. Do you not know that the wicked will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor male prostitutes, nor homosexual offenders, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. That is what some of you were, but you were washed and you were sanctified. You were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ by the Spirit of our God.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got some pretty specific words, don't we? We heard in English, in 3 different translations, we heard effeminate, male prostitutes, and abusers of themselves with mankind, homosexual offenders, sodomites. So those first 2 words that I just said, effeminate and male prostitutes, that was, even though that's 2, those were the words used in all 3 of those translations. That, those are the translations of the word malakos in Greek, which is best translated as soft. Like soft, yeah. Like a bed is soft. Effeminate comes out of using that word to apply to, say, a boy who is kept as a sexual partner to a man, which would have been, that was something in Greek culture. That was a thing that happened. So like an effeminate boy, a soft boy. Male prostitute is another reasonable translation for that particular word. Okay. The second word, so the 3 translations we heard, abusers of themselves with mankind, sodomites, which of course we have a problem now with the word sodomites because we know that Sodom isn't about that, but we still know what the translators meant when they said sodomites, right? Or homosexual offenders, right? Come right out and say it. That word is arsenokoites. Arsenokoites is a word that only appears twice and is very difficult to translate for that reason. So when you're looking at Greek words or any other ancient language, the difficulty is always figuring out what this word means. And so to figure it out, it's helpful to look at where this word is found in lots of other places. So when you find a word that isn't used in other places, you wind up with a hard time because you have to kind of guess at what that word means. And so the best translation that, exhaustive survey of the literature at the time, okay, seriously, don't make me read my thesis to you. The best translation is male prostitutes. And that's a translation that comes from Bill Countryman, who is the professor of New Testament who was at CDSP when we were there. He also wrote a book called Dirt, Greed, and Sex, and the reference to that is on the handout that I'm going to give you. Wonderful book, definitely an academic kind of book, but that's the best translation that we can come up with. Other people are like trying to figure out what it means. Some folks try to make it like reference back to Leviticus and kind of do this funny thing with Hebrew words and pushing them into Greek and that kind of thing. The fact of the matter is simply that we don't have a lot of versions of this word, and the best translation we can come up with would be male prostitutes. So it's interesting that we have, say, homosexual offenders, right? And that moves us into a question of translation. Because we have to remember that the Bible was written in Hebrew and in Greek. And even the Hebrew and the Greek were different, particularly the Hebrew. I mean, it was written over so long that the language changed. And even parts of the New Testament are easier or more difficult to read or whatever because of the Greek that's used. Ancient languages, you have to get back into the language and the culture and the way people used those words at that time in order to be able to translate them out. And when we do this kind of translation, I say we very loosely because I don't do it, we are translating into our own culture, our own set of understandings, hence the word sodomite, right? Because that word was seen as meaning what they were trying to get across. But also into our own set of belief systems, our own stuff that we think is going to come through in the translation. So you get this word, homosexual offenders, which isn't actually a good translation of the word. But whoever it was who was coming up with the translation, I'm sure it was a committee. And it's not just the NIV, that's also what we look in the NAB, the New American Bible, has that same phrase.
Practicing homosexuality.
Is practicing homosexuality.
Which conforms with Catholic theology now.
So that's actually a really good example because that's a Catholic translation, and the translation wasn't always practicing homosexuals, was it? We had an older version of the New American Bible that didn't say that, but then they had a revised version that put that in there, partly because the Catholic theology, right? Theology was that, okay, being gay is a state of being, but as long as you're celibate, then it's okay. It's when you're not celibate that it's not okay, right? That was and I think continues to be, I don't know, the official Catholic teaching. So practicing homosexual offenders, right? Kind of the same thing.
But the point is that they've put into the Bible, now they refer back to this thing.
Right.
Say, look, it says in the Bible, it agrees with what we think, but it didn't say that until they put it in.
It didn't actually say that, and it wasn't a very good translation.
It's translated to conform to the theology.
And there's one more use of that same word, arsenokoites, and I'd love it if we could just hit 1 Timothy 1 verse 10. Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Who's speaking again in this passage?
Paul.
Okay.
These are letters to Paul. Yeah.
Maybe I'm not hearing it correctly, but I didn't hear any reference to women.
Nope, again.
The only biblical reference to women's same-sex activity is in Romans.
No women prostitutes.
Yeah, there were.
Well, so there were.
Male prostitutes. I didn't hear women
Those
prostitutes.
are ones of consequence, I think.
Women
They
didn't matter
probably would have come under the phrases, let's see, we've got in the NIV, I've got sexually immoral, adulterers. In the KJV, I've got fornicators and adulterers.
So that could be.
That would probably count, right?
Okay,
Yeah. Don't worry, they were in there too. But it's not. But that would be prostitutes servicing men, right? So we're not dealing with same-sex things. The only place that there's any reference at all to women's same-sex activity is in the Romans passage. So Aisha, do you have 1 Timothy 1:10?
Yes, I do. It simply says, for whoremongers, for them that defile themselves with mankind, for man-stealers, for liars, for perjured persons, and if there be any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine.
Thank you. And Andy.
Fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to the sound teaching that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which he entrusted to me.
Thank you.
Hmm.
And
He's still
I'm
looking.
sorry, I know,
I
because you don't have the fixed Bible.
I have the Timothy.
I
one.
like the
It's
last part,
1 Timothy
and trust
1,
it to the-
verse 10.
Okay.
Yeah, see, everybody else has tabs because I fixed it yesterday. And you're just bailing me out. I want everybody to know that George is bailing me out because I didn't have an NIV to put the tabs in.
Oh, okay.
So George has
Okay,
his, he brought his NIV.
110.
110, yeah.
Okay, let me see the 10 stories here.
You know, it seems to me when you're reading different passages, early Christianity was very elitist. You can't do this, you can't eat that, and yet the idea was to go out among all the peoples and bring them in. But the rules are very elitist.
Those, remember, are the Jewish rules.
Okay.
So
Leviticus.
the Leviticus holiness code that we were talking about what you should and shouldn't do and what you shouldn't eat. Paul was going to the Gentiles, and he was actually not telling them that they had to subscribe to those rules. He was telling them that Jesus had overthrown those rules and that they are welcome to come. Yeah. So I see what you're saying, but it's not quite. It's not quite
strict,
accurate.
is
Yeah,
And
exactly.
And that is said very clearly in Romans 2 that we talked
Right.
about this morning, where he
Did
said
Paul
that
start
the
out-
Gentiles also could be looked at favorably. You didn't have to be a Jew.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Did
Yeah.
Paul start out as a Jew?
Yes, he was Saul, and then
Saul,
he
okay.
he was persecuting the Christians, and then he fell off his horse.
Yeah.
Jesus talked to him. Stuff changed.
Concussions will do it.
Nice concussions and everything. You have 1 Timothy 1:10.
I do.
Good.
110. For adulterers and perverts, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine.
Okay, thank you. So in this case, that word arsenokoites is there again, and it's hiding in 3 different places. In the KJV, it's them that defile themselves with mankind, which is talk
Wrong.
around. In the one that George just read, they're translating it as perverts. Interesting, right? Previously that word they translated as homosexual offenders, and now they're translating it as perverts. Huh. And then in the NRSV, it's sodomites. Which again, we have that problem, but they're being very specific, right? This is also arsenokoites. So the best translation that we know of would be male prostitutes, which puts a completely different spin on the whole thing. I mean, it's totally different. It's a completely different thing. There is one other biblical argument that people make sometimes, and I refer to this as Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve.
Oh, yeah, I heard that.
You heard that one? I didn't make it up. I wish I had made up that catchy phrase, right? But so this argument is grounded in the 2 creation stories in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, in which the first 2 human beings are a man and a woman, and they're created different ways in each of the stories. If you're not familiar with them, go read them. But we have a man and a woman who then have children, right? And this is kind of the prototype. This is seen as these are the original people, a man and a woman, they're having children. Therefore, this is the right way of things. This is how things are supposed to be. Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. So there's 2 things to look at here. One is absence does not imply condemnation. Right? Just because the Bible doesn't talk about something doesn't mean that the Bible is against it. There's kind of a humorous example of this that was in some of the literature that I read. The Bible talks about mentions dogs here and there. There are dogs. There aren't cats. Should we conclude that cats are hated by the Bible, that cats are an anathema, that the Bible condemns cats? Well, I don't know. There's a lot of us who would be upset about
I hope
that.
not.
I hope not, right. So, right, I mean, it's just as ridiculous. It's just, when you look at how ridiculous it is, then you realize, oh, okay. Here's the other thing. Procreation and producing children, right? So we've got Genesis. the creation narrative. And we need, the people tell these stories, creation stories, in order to explain the world we see around us. Well, we see a lot of people. Well, where did all these people come from? Well, we know where people come from. You know, they're babies. A mommy and a daddy have a baby. That's where people come from. So we put that into our creation stories, and we make it important that there's babies and that people take wives, or that, see, the men take wives, because you don't really hear about the women. And there's more babies, and it's all about creation and growing and flourishing and all of that stuff. But there's nowhere that says that procreation is the only legitimate purpose for marriage, right? There are people who claim that that's what the Bible says. It doesn't say that. And furthermore, none of us really believe that, because if we did believe it, then we would require people to take fertility tests before they could get married. We would prevent any marriage between people who either had decided that they weren't going to have children or were past childbearing years, right?
About older people.
Exactly. So it's just ridiculous. So we recognize, both religious organizations and civil law recognize marriages that are not intended to produce children. So this whole idea of biblical marriage, you know, whatever. Let me show you biblical marriage. How many people was David married to? How many concubines did they, you know, I mean, biblical marriage, if nothing else, is a good example of polygamy.
Yeah.
Solomon.
And Solomon, right, Solomon, thank you. Abraham, wives and concubines, in the interests of procreation, because that was what was necessary at the time. I mean, it's not, you know, don't talk about biblical marriage as a way of upholding homophobia. A couple of broader issues. I think we've covered all the specific verses. A couple of broader issues. We've talked about a little bit about translation and the importance of translation, and it's interesting, right, to read different translations. And if you go online, you can find websites that have multiple translations that you can search, and you can look at parallel, you know, the same verse in different translations. It's really interesting. So, you know, check that out. The two main ways of translating that were and interpretation that we're looking at right now, specifically interpretation that we're looking at right now, are historical critical interpretation and literal interpretation. So historical critical interpretation of an ancient text requires that you really look carefully at the context the text was written, the culture it was written in, who it was written for, what would have been the understanding of those people who had read it at the time, right? What would they have understood? So it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of scholarly work. It's hard. Literal interpretation, folks who want to use a literal interpretation will say that it's not interpretation. They'll say, well, I'm just opening the book and I read the plain words and that's what it says. But we've seen that depending on your translation, right, the plain words can say pretty different things and lead us to pretty different understandings. And also the circumstances that we live in now are completely different from the circumstances that
Don't we have
existed.
words in our current usage
Yeah.
that 100 years ago meant a totally different
Yes,
thing?
exactly.
I mean, out of sexual, not necessarily
Yeah.
sexual words, but everyday
All
words.
kinds of everyday words, right. And that's only 100 years,
Yes.
right? Now let's talk about 2,000 years
And
or
a different
3,000
language.
years.
And
And
a
a
different
different
culture.
language.
Yeah.
And a language that, you know, is hard to get back in, and here's, you know, here's the two times this one word appears, and how do we really know that that's what we think it means, you know? So we got a lot of that, right? Here's another question that's important. What do we mean when we say homosexuality or LGBTQ, right, people? What are we talking about? Because the concept that we have now, that two people of the same sex might be attracted to each other, fall in love, get married, have a family, whatever, right? That was not a thing. That was not a thing that existed during biblical times. during biblical times, marriage was about property, it was about politics, it was about procreation. That's it. And the only way to get that stuff happening is with a man and a woman, right? So if people didn't love each other, it didn't matter. I mean, romantic love was not a thing that people actually acknowledged or paid attention to, by and large, Song of Solomon notwithstanding, until much later. So what we understand as an orientation, right, just wasn't a concept. I'm not saying that there were not gay, lesbian, transsexual people, right? Obviously, one would assume that there were, but it wasn't a concept that people had a way of thinking about or talking about.
Well, don't you think it didn't happen because there was a moral code put in front of them? They were afraid, or?
No, I think it was more of a cultural thing, not like, oh, this is a bad thing, but like this just doesn't even, it's not even important. Like, because you have to have children, because that's how your line gets continued.
Yeah.
And if you're a widow with no children, for example, right, that's a tremendous problem. So you have, for women, you have to be attached to a man. You have to either remarry or have a son. And for the men, the impetus is different. It's, you know, keeping your line going, and you're going to have somebody take care of you when you're old, too.
But 50, 60 years ago, two men living together, two women living together, you thought, oh, look, they're helping each other. They're sharing costs. You didn't think
Right.
really of the other thing.
Right.
You just assumed it was convenience, which it is anyway, but I mean, it just wasn't in your vocabulary, really.
Right. It wasn't in the, thank you. I appreciate that because I think that there are many examples that you're talking about. I mean, in my own family, I have a couple of aunts who, you know, never married, you know, and lived with their friend. And who knows what was going on or not going on. It doesn't matter, right? But these were people who were emotionally dependent, intimate with one another. They loved one another, they lived together. They functioned as a couple in society. Who cares what was happening in their bedroom? That doesn't matter. But that's exactly what you're talking about. And so there could, Scott, easily have been that kind of liaison happening still. In fact, there are a couple of examples in the Bible of same-sex couples that are like that. David and Jonathan in the first book of Samuel, Ruth and Naomi in the book of Ruth. Both of these were couples who were emotionally intimate, dependent on one another. They loved one another. I don't know about sharing expenses. Well, Ruth and Naomi certainly were. But both of them, of course, at least in both of them, you've got at least one heterosexual marriage. In David's case, you know, David is sort of infamous, right? But those relationships were primary, important, same-sex, emotional relationships. We don't know what was going on in the bedrooms, and it doesn't matter. It's not in the Bible. It doesn't say anything about that. But when you read those parts of the Bible, you will see these are close, intimate relationships.
And
So-
Jesus, I think that's one of the reasons why he always talked about widows. How
Yeah.
empathetic he was about widows.
Mhm.
Because he knew that women without men, how they were treated.
Right. Yeah, a woman without a man couldn't, you know, she was either had to be a prostitute or a beggar. Those were your options.
In some societies today, that's still true.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I just have two other very small bits and pieces to kind of add to it, because we are running out of time, which is what is the overarching message of the Bible, and what is the heart of Jesus' message? Right? Because we can look at little tiny individual verses and you know, a longer story like the story of Sodom and so on. But really what we need to look at is the whole Bible, and most specifically for Christians, the whole story of Jesus and the what flowed out of Jesus' life and death and resurrection and teachings, so that we can find that in the letters and so on. What are those messages? Are those messages of exclusion and hatred? Are they messages of openness and love?
Even tax collectors.
Even tax collectors, right? So Jesus ate with tax collectors. I mean, the phrase tax collectors and sinners, right? I mean, he hung out with the people who were rejected by the society that he was with. And that's a huge message. But it's hard to just kind of pinpoint it when somebody's pinpointing one verse. But that's enormous. The inclusion. And all of that, all of those ones from the Old Testament where it kind of seems very exclusionary, right? Yeah. Do this, don't do that, eat these foods, don't eat those foods. The Old Testament is well understood as a document of the relationship of God with God's people, specifically with the chosen people, the people of Israel who became the Jews. How did God relate to them? And then how did they relate to God? We hear over and over, God tells the people do these things, and then the people do that for a while, and then they do something else, and God gets upset with them, and they turn around, and whatever. Yeah.
Well, isn't the Bible the Jews' viewpoint of their relationship with God?
Right. Yes.
And they are the chosen people according to them,
right, from
God. But that doesn't mean, but Jesus brought out that everybody is included, not just Jews.
Right. Jesus expanded the covenant.
Yes.
Right. So at first so when we're reading the Old Testament, that Leviticus and all of that, that's very specifically focused on these people. But then Jesus came and expanded the covenant first to, in today's gospel, right? The man that he healed, the man who was a demon, who had demons, he was not a Jew. So that was Jesus's, he's reaching out across the lines. Now, that didn't go so well, because then the people told him to go away, right? But he did it again, right? He did it at other times as well. And then that got expanded more and more as Paul went out and as other missionaries went out to tell folks about Jesus. And that's documented in the New Testament about what we were talking about earlier, that they didn't have to become Jews in order to follow Jesus, that they could simply start to follow Jesus. So that expansion, yeah.
What stands out to me is how little there is. There's nothing in the gospel.
Right. Jesus never says one word about gay or lesbian people. Right.
And then what actually stood out to me was the statement in Timothy about slave traders, because there's a lot of the gospel, if you wanted to make an argument for slavery,
right,
could say he mentions it over and over again, it doesn't condemn it. Is there anything else condemning slavery besides that?
I would have to look that one up.
I would say it's implicitly condemned by the Exodus story. Basically the story is saying, you all started out as slaves, and God loved you more than he loved the Egyptians, or he freed you from the Egyptians. This was the big central story.
Right. There's also Philemon.
Half the people in the Roman Empire were slaves.
Even more than half, maybe.
More than half. Right. So you have to remember that the whole town of Corinth was started by people who were freed slaves. So slavery was a very common thing in that era.
And it was also a different kind of slavery than the chattel slavery that we had in this country. It's not to mean that it's okay.
Nothing about race.
No, there was nothing about race. And
anybody could end up a slave.
And I'm not saying it was all right, but it's a different. We would have to really go back and really understand what exactly was going on. But I think about the letter of Philemon, where Paul sends Onesimus, who is a runaway slave, back to his master. So Onesimus has run away to be with Paul, to be a Christian, has become a Christian. Paul sends him back, and which is a huge risk, right? Because the master could, I guess it's Philemon is the master's name. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, it's letter 2 Philemon.
He could punish him, right? He could do whatever. But Paul is saying, greet him as a brother. Essentially, Paul is saying, free this slave. He's a Christian now, just like you. He's your brother. So, while that's not a specific, it's implicit, sort of like what Michael was saying. Yeah. Yes.
Can you refresh my memory about Noah and the ark experience and what was going on with the brother?
You mean afterward?
What?
When he was drunk?
Noah? Oh,
Well, the Noah's Ark story is,
Oh.
wasn't there, the husbands and wives were, wasn't there something going on under deck, so to speak?
Not on the boat. I think that I think after the flood was all gone and the animals were out doing their thing and the people were trying to reestablish themselves, there was some stuff that happened after that. Noah getting drunk,
But I thought it was
wasn't
his
real pretty.
sons.
His sons,
Relatives.
You're talking about there's
some
some,
stuff about he gets drunk and he falls down and he's naked and he's passed out, and one son, I think, sees
you
him
see them naked, right?
naked and goes to the other two, and the other two take a blanket and walk backwards over him to cover him up,
Yeah.
so they don't get punished, but Ham does.
It's a
the
story-
curse of Ham.
it's a story to denigrate the Canaanites because it's the grandson Canaan who's the one that laughs at Noah. Because every nation is represented by a person who in the story becomes the ancestor of that people. And so you can sort of see what they're saying about various different nations by the individual that represents them. And
Right.
Canaan is the one that laughs at Noah. And Canaan, of course, the Canaanites are the people the Jews were going to fight.
Is that where the Cain and Abel story?
No, it's different.
That's another.
Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam and Eve.
Canaan is the country that the Israelites come to and conquer when that's the promised land.
Uh-huh.
So we have to explain that the people there were bad.
Right.
See.
Because remember, later on we're told, the Jews are told to go in and destroy them. And actually all that Leviticus stuff was about how you make sure that you are you and that you don't accept them. You're not going to marry any of those bad Canaanites. You're not going to, you're going to kill them all, which didn't actually happen historically. But,
So like the curse of Ham, the black
Right.
people were cursed.
right.
Yeah, because of it. what
Right.
happened.
It was said to be the ancestor of everybody who lived in Africa.
Right.
Yeah, all the black people.
Kind of related to this is
Yeah.
the whole thing about sexuality and
Please, thank you.
I want to say something about sexuality in Roman
Thank you
times
for coming.
and what was kind of the norm. And I think what's being critiqued in a lot of ways is the whole domination aspect of it.
Yeah.
That everything was about someone was always the dominator and someone was always the dominated. And it was very much a part of Roman culture. I mean, I don't think we understand that fully. I mean, you have to go to Pompeii and see the pictures on the walls to kind of get this,
Yeah.
And I think what a whole lot of the Bible is critiquing is things in that context, which is not fully translatable to our context, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Well, I mean, and that's why it's harder, right? Look, it's a lot harder for us to sit here around this table and talk. We have been talking for more than an hour now to kind of get into some of this stuff and understand it, and that would be a whole nother thing where it's really easy for some guy to open up a Bible that has the word homosexual offenders in it or sodomites and point at it and go, see, it's in the Word of God. So
Well, and
that's why we're here.
It would seem as though all of those things that are exploitation
Mm-hmm.
and violence and domination in context of the time,
Mm-hmm.
and humanity has moved out of animal thinking, and that was also tribal, what you're describing as
Absolutely,
tribal thinking,
yes.
moving into community more,
Mhm.
community against community, and we're moving into a spiritual consciousness, and so it becomes exploitation versus reverence.
Mm-hmm.
Reverence for life, the recognition of every human being of the Christ within.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of those sins or whatever, people were doing that usually out of exploitation, not out of choice.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's a difference between expressions of love today
Right.
versus putting labels on it.
Yeah.
Because it's not exploiting. We have the same problems. We are having child exploits. I mean, there's sexual exploitation going on today.
Right.
And those people
Right.
find themselves in lifestyles due to circumstances beyond their control.
And imagine
Right.
what's going on in a society where 50%, and I've actually heard the number maybe as high as 70 or 80% of the population were slaves. What kind of society is that? What's going on in
But we're all
relationships?
slaves. Well, the whole point of the scripture is Christ sets us free, but it's a process.
But also Sacramento, one of the largest areas, for teens and young sex
yes.
trafficking.
Yeah.
Yeah, in certain areas. We don't see it as much. I went to a forum and I was surprised because I wasn't aware.
It is a huge thing.
It is a huge in this area, Sacramento.
So condemnation is not the answer.
Oh no.
Of
Yeah.
anything.
No, let's try
It's
to
reverence.
get help. So like you were saying, some people they're out on the street for a variety of reasons. So to have a situation so these teens or young people who are out on the street and get kidnapped, where can they go to get help? To get out of those situations.
I have something I'd like to share. If you find it really interesting to learn about the Old Testament, the Deanery has an Education for Ministry group out at St. Francis. It's on Monday afternoons. We'll be starting again in the fall. We meet from 1 to 3:30. And it's through Sewanee University of the South. So you can go online, look up EFM on Sewanee University of the South. We have room in our group for more people. If we could get 6 people here at All Saints who want to do it, we could have an evening group, but it takes a minimum of 6 people. So if you think you know of people who might want to do it, first year you study Old Testament, second year is New Testament, third year is church history, fourth year is theology. And in each group meeting, we always do a spiritual, a theological reflection where you look at where is God in your life and in our culture. So see me if you're interested.
Thank you. Scott?
How's the Jewish community dealing with this situation? Do we know?
Well, so I don't know a lot about it. I know that it depends on what kind of Jew you are. Like, so Reformed Jews, Conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews would be the 3 major streams of Judaism. I mean, I don't know. I'm not Jewish. I'm not a rabbi. I don't know any rabbis, and I haven't asked them. A couple of different things I can say. I have a good friend who is an observant conservative Jew, who we haven't talked about this particular thing, the Orlando thing, but she is very clear that these laws, Levitical laws, don't apply, and that what that we're talking about different things. That, and there was an article, that was floating around Facebook about folks from an Orthodox synagogue who finished the holiday, which was Shavuot, which was the holiday that was actually happening at the same time that the shootings happened, and that holiday ended on Monday evening. And he brought his congregation to a gay nightclub, and they talked and prayed and hung out with people and that kind of thing. On closer inspection, they called that a modern Orthodox or something or other. There was a modifier to Orthodox, so
there is.
I think the question would be what do Orthodox Jews teach, and I don't know the answer to that.
What surprised me is
Yeah.
that I saw on it was on the TV these Muslims. This one man in Florida, he's black, he's a Muslim, and he's also gay. He talked about Islam, and this other imam who also said that they didn't, that, in his interpretation, they didn't condemn homosexuals,
Right.
and that he was also doing a whole prayer thing,
Yes.
prayer
Yes,
around.
Yeah.
they went to.
I think it's the
Yeah.
same. I think it's actually very similar a situation
That's
as it is in
me.
Christianity, in that it's much more of a cultural prohibition than it is in any sacred text. I mean, I'm not a Quran scholar. I cannot speak to that, but that's my understanding of the Muslim community as well as of the Jewish community, is that we're talking much more about a cultural issue that gets clothed in words that we pull out of Scripture.
I mean, it happens so much there.
Rabbi Monnot at our local
Temple
synagogue,
Israel.
she has been performing same-sex marriages since long before we started doing it in the Episcopal Church.
Really?
Absolutely.
Which temple is
And
that?
that's a reform.
On
That's
the
the
side.
congregation behind
Oh, down
Israel.
there, down.
Because that's
Riverside?
reformed
Oh,
over there.
okay.
Yeah. So, I'm recognizing that we've gone over time, and are there any other questions? I have handouts for everybody.
Yeah.
I will
Thank you for
Thank you
doing
so
this.
much.
This-
Thank you.
This
welcome.
gives more
Yeah.
varied
So it's
angles
it's
to look
wrong
at.